everyone. Welcome to Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. This broadcast is brought to you by Mace Media Group and Terpenes and Testing magazine, the industry's first publication dedicated to cannabis science. I'm Jason Lupoi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Terpenes and Testing magazine, and I'll be your host as we navigate across the landscape of cannabis and psychedelics science. Cannabis provides a unique organoleptic experience. The complexity of the scents of cannabis cultivars invokes a cornucopia of married aromas with notes and nuances from the deep woods, the earth, spices, sweet citrus, delicate flowers, or loud diesel gas. If we were blindfolded, the scent of the plant speaks to us, telling us its name without us ever laying eyes on it. The nose knows what's good for us. I've talked about this before, but it's especially relevant to today's episode. While researching for my book, The Cannabis Terpene Experience, I discovered that some of the plants that make up my core favorites contain some of the dominant terpenoids. Linalool ranked at the top, being in lavender, hops, jasmine, bergamot, different teas, basil, oregano, and of course, cannabis. I seemed to be seeking these plants out, wanting to consume them both in scent and flavor. My nose led me to them, but from a chemical perspective, did my body need these molecules to improve my individualized overall wellness? So for this episode, I wanted to speak with Dr. Avery Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert is a smell scientist and author. He has conducted research on human odor perception in academic laboratories and in the R&D divisions of multinational perfume companies. His consulting firm, Synesthetics Incorporated, helps companies design scented consumer products. He is the founder of Headspace Sensory, a startup company that is quantifying the aroma profiles of cannabis and hemp. Dr. Gilbert's first book, What the Nose Knows, The Science and Scent of It in Everyday Life, is a fast-paced tour of the latest discoveries and how they challenge long-held beliefs about the sense of smell. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science and Technology and was shortlisted for the Royal Society Prize for Science Books. It's available on Kindle and Audible Audio from Amazon.com. Dr. Gilbert, I'm elated to have you as a guest on the podcast. Welcome.
Jason, hey, thanks very much for inviting me. Glad to be here.
So I'd like to start off by discussing how your work and your expertise has led you to cannabis.
Well, it started about 7 years ago when we moved to Colorado. I'd been working as an independent consultant in the fragrance industry for a long time and had enough of the East Coast and didn't have to be there since everything's by the internet these days. So I came to Colorado and thought, well, what's local that I can get involved in smell-wise? And I had two opportunities. One was cow manure, which is a big issue at feedlots around the state. Makes a lot of people angry at the smell it. And the other was cannabis. Cow manure is an important economic issue. It's a right to farm thing, but people would like to be able to keep neighbors happy. And from my point of view in the fragrance industry, nobody really nailed down the bad actors in feedlots. So I looked into that, but then I started touring dispensaries here, where it's been legal since 2014. And I was just blown away by the range of aroma types and the character. I mean, you had everything from these citrus fruit cocktails all the way down to these very woody, earthy herbal notes. And it was just, I had to get into it. I realized nobody really tackled it before from a purely aroma point of view.
Compared to other plants that you've had familiarity with, have you found cannabis to be more of a sensory challenge to study and understand?
It's turned out to be pretty straightforward from my point of view as a smell scientist. There are lexicons that are kind of formalized by different trade groups for coffee, for example, for tea, beer. There's the wine aroma wheel from UC Davis. But, we in the course of doing my work with aromatherapists or companies that are making air fresheners, we figure out what the key descriptors are for the category and then use those to evaluate the product and to see if the perfumer's formulations are getting close to the target. So for me, it was a fairly straightforward exercise. Of course, I didn't know if we'd have clear results or not. Luckily, we did.
Could we talk a little bit about our olfactory sense and how we as humans have utilized this sense in an evolutionary way? And for example, I was curious if you could talk about how I've heard that our sense of smell involves our selection of mate, like an evolutionary process of selecting a mate.
Yeah, it does. In fact, that's a very common thing throughout mammals in general. That's how I got into studying smell. I was interested in animal behavior, and a lot of animal behavior involves mate selection, kin recognition, mothers recognizing their offspring, and vice versa. Um, there was the whole issue of pheromones, which definitely is a thing in insects, and a little bit more controversial than whether mammals respond to them that way. But that's what got me interested in the thing. And there are there's a lot of studies that indicate that um, some mate selection might be biased by your genetics at the HLA uh, genetic zone, which involves the immune response and say tissue rejection for organ transplants. And so you have disassorted mating where people basically seek out people with a different kind of immune system, which would have an evolutionary benefit. So
Hmm.
it's there. It's at the most intimate levels of sexual arousal, as well as mate choice and familiarity. And it's an important role in food selection and emotional response.
Yeah. I was curious. I was looking through your publications, and I saw that you wrote a paper that discussed the color of smells. And I was curious if you could talk about what this means. You had mentioned that the stronger a smell, the darker the color. And without knowing much about the rationale, it just for some reason seems very logical to me, like it makes sense. And I was wondering if you could talk about what color of smells means and why this is the case.
Well, this stems from this work I did back when I was working with Givaudan, a flavor and fragrance house. And I was trying to find ways to get people to describe smells non-verbally. People have a lot of, fragrance evaluators and perfumers have a very sophisticated, detailed language for describing smells. But it's hard you have to train people with that. And so I just wanted consumers to be able to take a sniff of something we were making and give us their impressions of it. So I decided to go for nonverbal responses using these kind of um, sensory metaphors. People are always, perfumers talk about notes being high and low. Sometimes a fragrance is too loud or it's got a soft impression. So I started a lot of work along those lines. I found that smells can line up on an auditory keyboard, and that what perfumers call top notes, these very light, floral, evanescent notes, are actually matched to higher pitches on the scale, and heavier notes are matched to lower pitch on the scale. Then we did color, having people blindfolded just smell things, and then pick color chips. And that was a couple of ways you can do it, but color chips was one. And after you get a couple dozen people and you find a consensus on what color a smell is, and then as you increase the intensity of the color, you don't change the hue, you don't change the color, but you change the darkness of it. So you've got color, it has hue, and darkness, and kind of brightness. These are these parameters of color. And odor strength corresponds to black white dimension of color. So it was kind of a nice thing. We showed that what's called synesthesia is really a demonstrable thing, and it's not an abnormal thing. Everybody has it to some degree or other, and it seems to have a real regular basis, a kind of correlation between the senses.
So when you surveyed people on what colors they saw when they smelled a given smell, was there a lot of overlap, or was it were people kind of pointing to the same thing?
They were kind of pointing to the same thing. By the time
Yeah,
you test a couple dozen people, you're getting a kind of group consensus around one color zone.
that's really neat. I was curious if you could talk about as well how different terpenes or essential oils or other aroma molecules would typically be utilized in a perfume. You just mentioned top notes. What would the roadmap be for a novel fragrance to typically look like?
Well, you have your top notes, which is the first thing that jumps out of the fragrance, comes out of the bottle and kind of grabs the consumer's attention. Typically, those are fruity or floral um, notes, and they blow away in the first few minutes. And then you get to the heart notes, which are a little more have a little more substance to them. And so here you can have things like tonka bean, deeper floral notes, incense kind of notes. And then after an hour or two, you're down to the dry down or the bottom notes. And that's what stays in your skin for hours through the rest of the day. And there you're talking about musks, for example, things with kind of lower notes, a kind of more subtle impression. So that's kind of how perfumes are structured. And of course, there's a lot of overlap when you're talking about making a perfume from um, natural raw materials, lavender and bergamot and so forth. Each of those individual oils has components that overlap with other oils. So at the end of the day, say linalool oil, you might be getting contributions from the lavender and from the bergamot and this, that, and the other thing, and ended up with quite a large slug of it.
So when somebody is creating a perfume, then if you're buying a perfume, rather, if just to smell it in the store, you're just smelling those top notes. And I've heard that you should actually, if you have a sample at least, and you don't have to buy the perfume right then and there, you should come back to it, a few hours later, maybe the next day, if it's a stronger perfume, and kind of see how you like it over those different times.
That's good advice. And that's where there are testers in the fragrance counters, although they went away for COVID, but I think they're back. Yeah, spray it on when you walk into the store, and then go shop for pants or whatever you're doing, and then then sample it on your arm later on. And you can do one on one arm and one on the other. When you're in the business, as I was, you often have like 3 on one forearm and 3 on another forearm. But that's cutting the bologna a little thin, I think, for the average person. So you can do one on one wrist, one on the other.
I wanted to talk about terpenes and cannabis, of course, because that's what we cover predominantly at Terpenes and Testing. And some states have started to list the dominant terpenes in a given cannabis product on the label. But could you discuss how and why a given cultivar or product scent may not be accurately described by just those dominant terpenes?
Well, here we come to the problem of how to describe smells in general. And if you take the approach of just listing off the component molecules in kind of descending order, just kind of reading off a list, you're not going to get too far into knowing what it smells like. Even a perfumer, if you tell him it's X% linalool, Y% beta-myrcene, when you go down a list, if he's familiar with that particular kind of perfume, maybe he'll have some general idea, but he needs to compound it and take a sniff to know really how it's going to make an impression on the nose. So I think the listing thing is a little bit problematic, and it's very tough then when you come to cannabis, which some people aren't that familiar with, or some people don't have a familiar with the whole range of aromas that come out of it. So I think the other way to tackle it is what I've done with Joseph DeVerde in these various papers, is just have people describe the different smells. Here's a list of descriptors like berry, apple, lime, whatever, and you have people tick off a ballot when they are sniffing one strain, then go on to the next strain and fill out another ballot. And from there you get a nice, reliable description of the profile of a particular cultivar or sample.
Are there specific terpenes that you could point to that might be very minor in a given product or plant that actually contribute, very strongly to the aroma?
That's a great question, because that's the other issue with the kind of chemical list of terpenes, for example, in cannabis. Some individual odor molecules are very potent. So in other words, at very low concentrations, they still pack a punch. And others have very low impact. I can pour a ton of it. For example, linalool is a great example. Linalool, I can put, just pour it in and pour it in and pour it in, and it doesn't really increase the impression of kind of light floral fruitiness that linalool has. It's just a
Right.
low impact fragrance. So even though it comes out on top as a component in a lot of different cultivars, it's not a big presence in the overall bouquet. And something that's present in very tiny amounts, trace amounts, could be what we call a key ingredient, and really kind of defining that cultivar.
You mentioned the papers that you had written where you had people come in and smell, different cultivars. And the one that I remember particularly regarded, maybe 13 or so plants, and people were picking out. You had collected some odor descriptors from online, different terms people were using, and some of them were super common, like diesel or earthy, and some of them were not so common, like I think chestnut was one of them. And it was really interesting because, one, you showed a nice histogram of all the, how many different notes or of these odor descriptors could people pull out, and I think most people were something around five or so. There were a couple outliers maybe that were down around 17 or 18 different notes. Do you think that people could really pull out that much? Like, is that something that you could do, being a smell scientist? You could kind of pinpoint a bunch of different notes like that?
That's actually a vexed question, because there have been studies exactly on that point. Like, given a fragrant bouquet, say a floral bouquet, how many, if they start making a combination of vanilla plus whatever, a two ingredient combination, then most people could pick out both ingredients. Add a third ingredient, and not everybody can get them all. By the time you get to four ingredients, very few people could pull out the individual notes by identity. And even perfumers and fragrance experts have a hard time. But with this so-called descriptive profiling, this is something, it's an easier task. We give people a ballot. There's a whole alphabetical list of these odor names, and you just pick it off if you get there. We're not expecting people to be experts. The initial people I tested, I was just like getting people off the streets, like, hey, I got $20, you got 40 minutes to sniff some weed. Usually the answer was a happy yes most of the time. And you can just tick them off. Now, some people tend to use a lot of descriptors, other people very few, but that's a kind of personal habit thing. We find that in every other kind of sensory quantification mode, whether it's if you're rating light bulbs or car outlines, it doesn't matter what. Some people are generous with their descriptors, other people are stingy. But what's interesting is that of those 13 samples, we got very stable and precise profiles across the whole set of people, analysts.
One of the things of, two aspects of the paper that I thought were really interesting is, one, I think you guys basically tried to standardize the THC content, but people still felt like they could smell potency.
Yeah, we asked people. I threw these in as these questions at the end of the test. I had people go back and smell every sample, and these are kind of perfume industry questions. They said, how interested would you be in smoking this sample? Which is the analogy is, would you wear this fragrance yourself? How much would you pay for it? And which again is a big issue in perfume. It's like I really love this fragrance. I'd spend, $20 at Walmart for it. Well, that's great. The Estee Lauder people are ready to commit suicide when they hear that on the other side of the mirror. They want to hear $100 a bottle. And then how high do you think it would get you? Which I just threw in there. And, what's the potency based on its smell? And there we had quite a spread of results. And with people choosing one particular type, the kind of citrus, lemony, sweet, pungent varieties were thought to be more potent than the woody, earthy herbals. So you can think indica versus sativa, but that's a whole other discussion. But those kind of impressions. And it was statistically significant, the difference in what people were willing to pay. But then when Joe DeVerdi looked at the THC content of the samples, it had absolutely no correspondence to the perceived strength. It was all over the map. So it's this preconception people have about the potency of a particular sample based strictly on smell. Where that comes from, I don't know. Whether it's like folk knowledge or some wired in brain thing, I'm not sure, but it's there.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me because, like you said, there was the table that showed, you know, that people were willing to pay more. At least those study participants were willing to pay more for the citrusy plants, and you know, perhaps thinking that they were more potent, or just liking them more than the woodsy and earthy ones. And that's one thing where in Pennsylvania, when I first started to talk to some of the dispensaries here, this was pre-COVID too, so I think a lot of things have changed with people being able to go into a dispensary and smell the different buds available for purchase. And I was talking to them about your work, and I was saying, like, there's like evidence here that, you know, if people could smell the product, it would either resonate with them or maybe not resonate with them. And you know, you talked about bringing sensory evaluation to cannabis, and one of the things that you had said in an article for Terpenes and Testing was, rather than chase higher levels of Delta 9 THC or CBD, breeders could chart a path towards hybrids with a desirable and possibly novel aroma character. And I think that kind of interaction with the product, just like you would a perfume, or like if you're doing a wine tasting in a winery, I think that's really a compelling part of the experience and the consumer purchase.
I think I absolutely agree with you. And I think, you know, what we're lacking, for example, is what in any other industry we call consumer segmentation. So maybe there are people that like the citrusy pungent types. Well, how much of the buying public are they? Your woody, earthy, herbal enthusiasts, I'm sure there's a dedicated band, but are they 10% of the market, 90% of the market? There's really a lack there. And so until the industry starts putting things in sensory terms and communicating with the consumers on that basis, you're really not going to have a good handle on what the target ought to be. And by the way, I was just writing about sniffing marijuana. I have a new 10 months old. I've been writing at Substack on Avery Gilbert Substack.com, and I was talking about how it's getting harder and harder to sniff what you're buying at dispensaries in Colorado. With COVID, people started, you know, what's only going to let 3 people into the shop. Everybody keep their distance, and we're not going to let people sniff anymore because it might spread COVID or whatever. So even though it's not a state law, it's still kind of by inertia has persisted, and you don't get to smell, you don't get to sample and see what the range is. I think that's a real choke on expanding the consumer base and getting people involved. And in California, I'm told it's worse because now you're going to almost all prepackaged. The days of having your bud tender tilt a jar towards you and take a sniff, that's over. And I don't know how you start educating and expanding your consumer experience if you don't do that.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the things that in Pennsylvania, you know, it's never been part of the experience, and you go in and everything's prepackaged. Like I said, they do put the terpene profile on the products, but you know, for the most part, it's the same big 7 or so every single time. And then some companies get down to like saponine and you know, terpenes that a lot of folks may not have even heard of at this point. But it's nothing that it's you buy it and then you try it. There's no way to experience it at the point of sale, and I think it's a real disservice because I think some people are very skeptical of cannabis still, and they want to kind of dial in what works best for them. And just like, you know, in the title of your book, the nose knows, and I think that kind of helps people identify something that they want to try or do not want to try.
Correct. And I think we're really we're making it hard for the industry to do that. Even and listing terpenes. I mean, you're a chemist, so you've smelled them. But what civilian has smelled neat beta carotene? I mean, it doesn't happen. This is the same quagmire that the perfume industry got into when they started talking about, ylang ylang. No civilian has smelled ylang ylang or tonka bean extract. I have because I'm on the inside, and but this is we have to communicate in a better way.
Absolutely. And I gave a presentation once and I was talking to people about, terpenes kind of being the navigators of the experience. And they were, you could tell that folks are overwhelmed by the fact that like they're getting these labels. And as a science nerd, like I love it. I love the data, but they're getting, a 20 ingredient product label and they don't understand what it all means. And I was telling them, basically my advice is to identify how you feel from this given set of molecules. And then from a different product, and I have an Excel spreadsheet with different terpene profiles that I've seen in different products. And I try to identify, how did I feel? Did I feel creative? Did I feel anxious? Things like that by that given collection. But you're absolutely right. Like even with that information, and is I think that using that information to kind of try to hone in on products that you like is definitely a viable option. But you're right that when somebody reads some of those ingredients, they have no idea. Maybe like a limonene, they can at least envision it sounds citrusy, worst case scenario. But as far as a sensory evaluation, kind of bringing that to cannabis, how would you foresee that beginning?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, just in terms of what we were just talking about, the way we teach perfume or teach, do smell training for people in the fragrance industry, it is just like you said, you let people make up their own kind of connections. Here's this ingredient. Does it remind you of when a wet puppy dog or something? Fine. That's your hook. You have to personalize it and get a hook that makes it there for you. You're not trying to memorize structures and chemical names and formulas. So the personalization is a big thing. Plus, it's such a central part of the experience of cannabis. But I think, how do we do this as an industry in general? I think we need to move towards some kind of common lexicon, some kind of common vocabulary, not all highfalutin and technical, but just a shared set of words that we can point to and we understand each other what it refers to. We used 48 different descriptors in that first paper in 2018, and we reduced it a little bit. And I noticed if you go to weedmaps.com, and you can sort by what they call flavors, kind of descriptors. Well, they have 44 descriptors, which are basically my list, minus 4 kind of rare things. Would I have liked some credit? Sure. But, I put it out there in a publicly accessible format, the PLOS One journal, just to get it out there. So I'm glad it's been taken up. That gratifies me. I think that's the kind of start we need to make a more standardized vocabulary, which is how, tea, coffee, and beer have gone. And then we can kind of come to an agreement on that. And then we can, there's a million ways to present that. There's all the odor wheels. You don't have to have a wheel. You could have any number of ways of presenting it graphically. And I think that's how you get a description. You can have shelf tags just like you do in the wine store. You can't pop each bottle and stick it in the wine store, but you get those shelf tags and you know what a kind of a fruity wine, a dry wine. You start understanding what this is in terms of like a Zinfandel or a Cabernet, and you can kind of get a sense of what you're buying. That would help.
Yeah, I agree. I see that we're just about out of time, and I wanted to ask you one more question. I was curious if we could just kind of end on, you've had this opportunity to study the sense of smell, and I was curious, what are some of the aspects of our sense of smell that you think most people would be shocked to know, and also what have you learned about our sense of smell that really surprised you?
I think people are much better than they think they are at smelling. And I think what's shocking is that it doesn't take a trained nose. Everybody bows down in front of perfumers. I shouldn't be saying this, some perfumer friend might hear me, but and sure, they're highly trained, they're very skilled and experienced, but their nose is no different than your nose, my nose, or any average guy on the street. It's just they put the time into thinking about it, memorizing, making those kind of personal connections, and that's something we can all do for our greater enjoyment, if not our professional advancement. So that's what's surprising, I think. The nose is pretty standard. It's the brain behind it that is what you can play with and leverage.
Do you think there's credence to, like I said in the outset when I was researching for a book about terpenes, that I started to realize that the plants that I liked without ever knowing, without ever knowing the chemistry of their sensory properties, which is why I wanted to smell them or eat them. Do you think there's credence that the molecules therein are something that my nose is kind of leading me to because I should consume that?
Yeah, I think people have predispositions and preferences for all kinds of natural products, aromatic natural products, and they're there. You have them. Most consumers aren't consciously aware because nobody asks them about it, but they're kind of built-in preferences or kind of subconscious preferences. Go with it, and that if you could express your cannabis preferences in terms of fruits, berries, vegetables, other products that you like, then I think that gets you down the road toward an appropriate choice right off the bat.
Yeah, that's I think that's definitely true. Well, Dr. Gilbert, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I could ask you at least 45 other questions, but we'll have to save them for another time.
Okay, Jason, good talking with you.
And thanks to all of you listeners for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. Until then, please come visit us at www.terpenesandtesting.com or on one of our social media platforms. Cheers.